regularly.
Hello, LibrePlanet 2021. This talk is titled Free Libre Solutions to Address the Shortage of Ventilators and will be presented by Robert Reed and Mark Jones. Robert L. Reed, PhD, has been a free software fan since 1988 and has taken that passion with him into director-level positions in the software industry of a Presidential Innovation Fellowship. His current project, Public Invention, aims to spur a movement for free hardware inventions. In the last year, has dedicated itself to a goal of free as in freedom ventilators to save lives during the coronavirus epidemic. He'll be joined in this presentation by Mark Jones, who, among many other services to the world of free software, is a pro bono lawyer for the Free Software Foundation. This talk will focus on Public Invention's efforts to coalesce the hundreds of attempts to create free Libre solutions for the ventilator shortage. Their conclusion is that the overall effect was mixed in terms of success developing ventilators, but very successful in advancing the global free hardware community. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bob. So the title of this talk is The Story and the Learnings of the Great Ventilator Rush of 2020. This time last year, almost exactly this time last year, I was speaking at LibrePlanet and was very quickly virtualized in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. At this time, it was a hair on fire emergency. At that time in March, we didn't know that social distancing would work or that people, particularly in the United States, would be willing to comply with it. We didn't know how to treat the disease. Based on experience at that time in northern Italy, it was entirely plausible that 1.5 million Americans would soon die because of COVID-19. Through a combination of positive action and negligence, we clamped that down to only 500,000 American fatalities last year. In 2020, there was predicted to be a massive shortfall of ventilators globally, which are needed to treat the most severe cases of COVID-19. Over 100 teams started working on free Libre open source ventilators. By June, doctors had learned that early ventilation was not as helpful for the ARDS associated with COVID-19 as it had been in previous diseases. Additionally, Ford, Tesla, and Dyson made tens of thousands of ventilators. GM made 30,000 and Ford made 50,000. By June, the sense of urgency and social impetus to develop ventilators had started to fade. This talk is about what happened in the free Libre open source ventilator rush of 2020 and what we learned from it. But it's also about a vision that Mark is going to speak to later. Our vision is that 20 years from now, medical devices will be abundant because there will be an internationally distributed supply chain of transparently and publicly testable free culture medical devices. We'll talk more about that later. The structure of the talk is that I'm going to talk about the story of the ventilators in 2020, the learnings from the FLOSS hardware teams that worked on it. I'm going to talk about the composable approach that we are taking, and this is going to echo Nadia Peek's talk in certain ways, and also Kyle Wien's talk. And then we're going to talk about the introduction of a beginning of a new free culture license for medical devices, specifically for medical devices. First, I want to say something very important. Public Invention has been working on ventilators, but ventilators are not the best way to save lives in COVID-19. Social distancing and personal protective equipment is. So wear your mask. Roughly speaking, everyone needs personal protective equipment. A small number of people will get sick with COVID-19 and need therapeutic oxygen or non-invasive ventilation. A small percentage of those people, about 1% of the total people who are infected, will need invasive ventilation, which is horrible. That's where you're heavily sedated and they put a tube down your throat and a machine breathes for you. I hope no one listening to this has to go through invasive ventilation. Nonetheless, in some cases, it's necessary to save lives. If you are invasively ventilated due to COVID-19, your chance of surviving is about 50%. We know that there are 100 hardware projects because we made a spreadsheet that tracked all of them. With the help of volunteers from Public Invention, we listed and communicated with every free ventilation project that we could find, and eventually there were more than 100, and we analyzed them along various criteria, including their licensing and how far along they were, their testability, certain features, and so forth. Now, obviously, if we were a single team, if we were a worldwide global community trying to address the pandemic, we would not create 100 projects to do exactly the same thing. However, there was no leadership or organization in place that could organize the work so that some of those many engineers who were doing the best they could in a difficult circumstance could work on a part of the ventilation problem. So if we look at what happened in time, I don't need to go into all of this, but by May, it was more or less clear that doctors had learned that you didn't need invasive ventilation as much as we had thought you would need it in March. The coronavirus was still exploding exponentially in a number of places, but by this time, the New York Times was no longer writing articles about the ventilator shortage, and many of those 100 teams slowed down their progress or quit entirely. If we look in the latter part of the year, the ventilator teams continued to lose steam, but some of them continued to make motion towards FDA approval, which is really important for what we're going to talk about in this talk, because that is an essential part and a very difficult part of what the Free Libre teams need to do. In January, America started vaccinating people. That has probably not had a mathematical effect yet, but we hope it will soon. We're not completely out of the woods because variants might cause problems, but there is reason to be hopeful. So the results in this overall effort were very mixed. The people who made Free Libre open source protective equipment, masks, gowns, face shields, were very successful and delivered at least 5 million pieces of PPE, probably more because, of course, with a free system, you don't track who all uses it. The Free Libre ventilator system failed to have much of an impact. Why? Because some designs went closed source and went dark. Some did achieve emergency use authorization from the FDA, but as far as I know, none have actually been used to save anybody's life. However, new communities were created, and there was an enormous spread of medical knowledge to engineers, including engineers which are in some cases dedicated to free hardware. And there is an idea of an emerging Libre respiration device ecosystem that I'm sort of leading. So there were at least 90,000 lightly involved volunteers from all over the world. Many of them were American, but not all of them. There were 70,000 at the group called Open Source Medical Supplies, which started as a Facebook group. There were 18,000 members of the Slack channel of Helpful Engineering, which is a US nonprofit which is dedicated to bringing free open source medical devices to market, which is a very challenging thing. There are 100 active members at Cosmic, which is the Canadian open source medical something collective, innovation collective, I believe. And there are at least 30 active volunteers at Public Invention, which is my own nonprofit. And so all of these organizations, there's also a European consortium called Just One Giant Lab, or it's pronounced JOGL sometimes, are, with some minor confusion, dedicated to making Free Libre open source solutions. So there's been a lot of spread to engineers, but there's been some confusion. So Mark, I'll hand it over to you now.
Thanks, Rob. So, why does Free Libre medical devices work here? I mean, this is about the spread of knowledge, right? So we have about 100 engineers now who fully understand mechanical ventilation. We could have more engineers. There are more engineers out there who understand the basic principles. There's more engineers out there who want to help with this. But they also need to be educated about this particular domain phase, right? So what we're looking at here as an organization of Public Invention, and also with the license that we're trying to design now, is about increasing the knowledge and access to knowledge knowledge that can be used in a productive way, and get that knowledge to the hands of engineers or manufacturers or whoever who thinks they can help, so that we can get that access sooner and start helping quicker. We had a lot of experiments around this, a lot of lessons learned around this, where we basically learned when engineers coming into this process, they didn't have an understanding of not just the engineering technology too, but how to work together and the legal liabilities around it as well. And that's really where we're looking at not just trying to create free Libre medical devices, but also looking at the licensing and how we're sharing the information around it too. Can you move forward, Rob? So the hope with free Libre medical devices is eventually they should be more trustworthy, right? Because the designs, the testing that go into it, that's going to be publicly available. People can look at it, people can scrutinize it. They know what's going on with that, with the development process. We're seeing that now with the COVID-19 vaccine. People are worried that it was rushed. And when you tell people, though they did all of the science, they did all of the development, they just sped up the bureaucracy, their willingness to take the vaccine increases. That transparency is important for people making informed choices about their medical care. It also reduces the expense around research as well. For people who are working in the free software community, we know that when we're building free software, one of the advantages is we can look at other people's efforts. We can borrow from other people's efforts. We can build, we can combine things together. That lets us do good things quicker at a lower price. So by sharing the knowledge that goes into the creation of medical devices, by making them Libre medical devices, we can reduce the price point in medical devices and essentially commoditizing some medical devices, which will increase access to everyone in the world who needs these things by lowering the price point. At the end of the day, we're talking about physical objects. It's not the same thing as free software. So yeah, there might be some cost associated with it, but if we can take out the costs, we can reduce the cost associated with research and development, we can increase the amount of access people have to the physical devices. Slide. So we're just looking at the complexity around this. So when you're thinking about the free culture community, the amount of development costs that goes into producing a material or an item often kind of relates to the licensing complexity as well. Free software, those licenses are actually a lot more complex than the Creative Commons licenses you typically apply to text, because there's concepts like, well, what do you do with compiled code? It's not the same thing. A book is a book. You can photocopy a page out of a book and you still have that page from a book. You can't just give someone a copy of a piece of software and expect that they can make a modification to it if it's compiled code. So you have to have licenses that account for that. When you start talking about hardware devices, the complexity increases as well. And it's not just because, oh, hardware is more complicated than software. Some software is really complicated, but you also change legal regimes that you're dealing with as well. So things like the CERN open hardware license, they don't have things like copyright that they can play tricks on, like copyleft, which is really successful in establishing the free software community. They're relying on contract law. When you're moving to medical devices, now you're dealing with privacy law, because you have to deal with all the research that goes behind it and protecting people's patient privacy. You also have to deal with regulatory approval processes that are not as standardized across the world as legal regimes like copyright or even patent. Slide. So some of the problems that we found when we were looking at this initially, there's a lot of confusion about free software licensing. I'm sure people who come to LibrePlanet are probably very familiar with the importance of using correct free software licensing and doing it in a way so that other people understand the rights that they have associated with it. And you understand why we're using free software licenses. We're trying to promote user freedom. But not all software developers in the world understand that. Not all engineers understand how to apply those into a different domain space as well. So talking to engineers about why we wanted to do this in a Libre way and not closing it up and not trying to seek royalties off of our ideas, why those weren't productive, was a big challenge here when we're trying to convince people about doing this in a Libre way. The benefits around this are going to be slow to graded because there's a long cycle in producing these devices, right? So going through the approval process, we need to develop devices and go through the approval process, and we need to figure out how to do it. It's a little bit harder when we're doing the licensing there. So it is taking a little bit of time, but what we found at Public Invention, we found some other groups like Helpful Engineering and Cosmic that are interested in doing this the long term, and some of these groups have already started the regulatory approval process. I think we have the interest in doing this, and the goal here is to do something in the long term. It's not a quick win because we know it's complicated. Pass it over to you, Rob.
Thank you. So what I'm going to do quickly is go through my opinions about the lessons that were learned across the entire community. I've been a big part of Helpful Engineering. I know something about open source medical supplies and Cosmic, and Public Invention has been right in the middle of this. So because I made that spreadsheet, I saw what a lot of teams were doing, and I'd like to present those as lessons learned from this hardware effort, which is a little different than what we might learn from normal software efforts. So the most important thing is to think not of being the solution, but a part of the solution. So in March, many people did the right thing and stood up and tried to save lives by applying their own talent to this problem. But they did the wrong thing by trying to do it in isolation. Now, granted, there were no organizations that helped. Many of these organizations I just mentioned, except Public Invention, were created during the pandemic. And so there was no structure to organize people, even with the techniques pioneered by the free software community to self-organize. Those were not generally available. But there was still a tremendous waste of effort for 100 teams to start working on the same thing. It was really a very difficult situation. So one of my heroes, Buckminster Fuller, the other being Richard Stallman, says, "Tell the truth, tell the whole truth, and tell it right now. If you're not open from the first day of your project, you're missing an opportunity." And this happens a lot. And when I was in the federal government, Eric Mill and I tried to promulgate the policy of being free and open from the first day of the project. Unfortunately, with ventilators, people thought, oh, well, we won't bother with that right now, but we intend to make it open source later. And that was always depriving the team of the insight of other people and depriving other people of the insight that the team produced. Be composable as the free software community is. So as far as I know, it goes back to Unix design principles, Unix existing in the 70s before gnu+linux, of making small pieces which can be piped together. And a number of people in talks here, including Nadia Peek, mentioned that exact principle. So composability is more important than modularity. If you can make parts which can be rearranged and stand independently, you make it easier for free Libre teams to participate together by working on small projects, and you make the overall capability much greater than it would be if every team were making a siloed product. Learn from free software team organization techniques. Use source code control systems from the first day, do unit testing, use automated test, continuous development. Agile development beats big design up front, even for medical devices. And there will be circumstances where people will say that's not true, but I think they're wrong. Even in the case of FDA regulated design and development processes, you should be agile with what you are doing. Now, one thing I would warn you about, I have hardly ever participated in a extraordinarily successful open source software project. I've worked on a lot, but none have been gigantically successful. When you work on a software project, you get to see how many times it's been forked at GitHub or GitLab, and you get little stars at those things, and you get to tell how many downloads your NPM package has had, or so forth. With hardware, it's worse, because 10 times fewer people are going to build your device, and they're not likely to tell you that they did in some cases. So you have to work a little bit more on faith. Building free hardware demands more organization, fundraising, management, and user experience than a software team does. And you just have to be prepared for that, particularly in an environment where the hardware team is completely distributed, either because what you're working on is so unusual, like a medical ventilator, that not very many people in one place are going to work on it, or because COVID-19 has forced you into social distancing, preventing you from working together in the first place. The communication burden for a hardware team is about 3 times that of a pure software team. On the right of this slide, you have a breadboard, not used for ventilator, but for another project the Public Invention runs to make a portable incubator for water quality analysis. And as you can imagine, working with a young person to debug that with a multimeter over video chat is challenging. But it can be done using text and video stuff. You can run a distributed team that is producing hardware. You may have slightly higher cost. The good news is that there is a tiny but growing free culture medical device movement. All of these organizations, although many of them are relatively new, are dedicated to doing what we would call free culture, although they don't use that word for it, to make medical devices. And many of them are committed to a long haul process. Certainly Public Invention is imagining this as a decade-long project. Licensing liability requires some thought. We advocate separating development from manufacturing. One of the things that happens when you think about deploying a device is that deploying a medical device is much, much harder than deploying a hobby device, which is much, much harder than deploying software. I believe very strongly you have to respect the FDA and other regulatory processes. There are no shortcuts that you can take when people's lives are on the line. But I assume most of you have read The Hobbit. As you know, the darkest time that Bilbo had was when he was walking down the tunnel to see Smaug for the first time before he saw the dragon. The dragons that we conjure in our mind are always more terrible than the real dragon. So getting FDA approval requires a lot of paperwork and is very difficult in a way that your average free software developer is going to find very annoying. But we don't need to exaggerate. It's just paperwork that you have to do, documenting things that you were probably planning to do anyway. And so I don't believe we should rebel against that regulatory process. I think we should try to work with it. Okay, so now I'm done with the lessons, and I'd like to take just a little bit of time to talk about something that Public Invention is trying to do, the idea of creating a respiration ecosystem. And this comes back to something that I believe his name was Kyle Weens from iFixit talked about, and also Nadia Peek talked about. If you can make a composable system of independent components, which can be combined to produce a net effect whose value is the square of those components, you can make this all a lot easier. And I believe that free software engineers inherently know how to do that in most cases. And if we can apply that to the hardware situation, which will be challenging, it's not exactly the same situation, we can get a lot of benefit. So I'd like to quote Leo Fender, the inventor of the Stratocaster guitar: if something is easy to repair, it's easy to construct. And repairing things is very important when you're in a low resource community and you don't have the medical equipment you need, for 2 reasons. First of all, you may not have the money to buy new equipment, but even if you could buy new equipment, you would have to retrain your staff on it. And so the ability to repair and maintain devices in that situation is literally a life-saving situation. So it's not so much a question of optimizing price, which is important. There are some communities are poorer than others, but optimizing logistics and the total cost of ownership for them. Now, you might ask, well, how is this at all possible with a ventilator? And it kind of is. This is just a basic model. Every ventilator is like this. What I propose is that we carry that a little bit further, and we have free Libre teams make the devices on the left, which are tied together by free standards. And Public Invention has done some very unglamorous work defining some respiration standards which cut across this entire field. We're also making an oxygen concentrator, by the way. But unfortunately, that's not the full picture. To save people's lives, you have to get FDA authority or CE authority from the European Union, and you have to get either for-profit firms, nonprofits or NGOs, or local firms to produce the device. And that requires a great deal of what we might call business leadership and financial leadership as well. But we can do it. So, and in an attempt to be composable, Public Invention has already produced 9 repos, which are independent. All of them, of course, are free Libre licensed to work on this effect, so that someone doesn't like what we're doing, they can take one of these ideas and not have to take all of them. This is an example of the display software we produce. I'm happy to say, I'm very, very happy to say that we are shipping the Ventmon T0 4.0, which is an inline device. You just plug the airway into this. This is a standard 22 millimeter airway, and it essentially is a sophisticated spirometer which can be used by engineering teams to test ventilators. Public Invention was given 2 grants, one by Protocol Labs and one by the Mozilla Open Source Software Foundation, to give these away free to teams which are Libre teams. So we've already given away 20, and the new batch is better. And we simply give them away free to people who sign a memo of understanding that they are making Libre products. And now over to you, Mark.
Thanks, Rob. So a little bit more about our regulatory sunlight-like license. It's still mostly notes. We don't have something we're ready to release yet, although if anyone knows about the FDA approval process in the United States or a comparable process in another country, I would love to talk to you about it. Essentially, we're trying to make an improvement over licenses like this or an open hardware license by trying to lean into the approval process. Like Rob mentioned, we believe that the regulatory approval process is important and it should be respected because it's designed to protect patients' lives and make sure that people are getting quality medical care. And we think that we can design a license that encourages sharing knowledge by leaning into that process and looking at what rights that process has created. That process creates mostly the rights around marketing and selling, and helping other people get that process to improve access around it. So some of the ideas we're thinking about right now is when it triggers. So submission to the regulatory body so that other people can also submit similar applications to also produce it as well. Slide from. And this really brings us back to our original vision here, right? 20 years from now, medical devices will be abundant because there'll be an internationally distributed supply chain of transparently and publicly testable free culture of medical devices. We think the more we make, more knowledge we make available around these devices, the more we lean into the existing systems, the more people who have access to this information to create devices, create more commodity devices, which will increase patient access to getting the medical care that they need. Give it over to you, Rob, to close.
Thank you. So the motto of Public Invention, which this talk is not really about, is to invent in the public for the public. And so it's really an attempt to take the principles of the Free Software Foundation and the GNU Manifesto and this community and apply them to hardware invention. The Public Invention would not exist without the Free Software Foundation. So I'd like to thank everybody here for all the work that they do. I would love it if people would visit our website, follow us on Twitter, or join our newsletter. If you have any interest in the open source hardware movement around ventilation, please contact me. I am attempting to stay in contact with everyone working on that. And we'll now open this up to questions.
Yes, I know that you were looking up in the channel, but we had one from early on that may have slipped by. Amelia had asked, it's been asked before, but how can we encourage medical device manufacturers to make their hardware and software free Libre? It's bad enough having proprietary hardware, but when the software running on life-saving devices is proprietary and hidden behind NDAs, that only benefits the manufacturer, not the patient or the healthcare provider.
It's a very good question. Go ahead, Mark.
That's a really good question, Amelia. I don't think I have an answer for it. Otherwise, I'd get together with the Free Software Foundation, the Software Freedom Conservancy, and make sure everyone heard the answer to it. I think a lot of it is trying to figure out how we motivate these manufacturers to see it's in their best interest. I mean, we saw that with routers, having free software routers, letting people hack on those. There's a reason why those are the only hackable devices out there. Why we don't see other hackable devices that let you put free software on them. I don't think medical devices are any different. We have that problem with TVs. We have that problem with cars. It's convincing the manufacturers that it's in their interest as well. There's an added challenge when the regulations come in place. I don't think that's a barrier necessarily, but I think there's a lot of fear around it. So how do we work with manufacturers who are getting these regulatory approvals so that they're not scared of what people are going to do with the hardware that they buy, or what people are going to do when they're making medical decisions about their own body?
So I'd like to add to that. So the only way you can do it is by passing laws. If you say to an existing medical manufacturer, open source or free your material, it's a non-starter. They're not going to do that. However, we should not frame the argument in terms of taking something away from them. 20 years from now, there should be a public commons of medical device designs, as the gentleman named Salt talked about in his work. What we want to do is create a license that produces a public commons. Large companies should make money making innovations to that commons, not preventing things from being used in that commons. And so I foresee a day in which a large company will be using open source and free Libre designs in some of their work and benefiting from that and reselling that, in addition to attempting probably to create monopolies on the innovations that they create.
Very good. Bradley Kuhn asks, thanks for proposing this new free culture license, and I look forward to seeing a draft. Do you think perhaps extending it beyond a pure copyright license would be helpful in dealing with the FDA instead of merely hanging on copyright?
I'll let Mark answer.
Yeah, Bradley, great question. 100%. The challenge that you have with hardware designs and trying to license them underneath free licenses is that there's only so many copyrights that you have in functional designs. A lot of times people ask, and I'm sure they ask of this you as well, Bradley, as well, should we get a patent on it? And I look at that and go like, why are we spending $100,000 to get a patent? And creating more proprietary rights around it. Like if it's already free, we don't need to restrict that. So I don't think patents are the right answer either. But when you're dealing with medical devices, there's two other legal regimes that I think there's the opportunity to kind of intersect with and see what other motivations that we can create. One is the regulatory process. So if you get a device approved the first time, similar devices have an easier time getting away through. And I think that's probably the thing I'm most interested in, is how do we make it so that we motivate people to create similar devices that have already been approved, and what rights can we attach if you're going to copy our device? Can we make that tempting, and can we encourage people who copy our devices to also continue to share the knowledge that they've created doing that? And then the other one is around privacy rights as well, because these are medical devices. So there's the opportunity or the likelihood that personal privacy rights might come into play. In the United States, privacy rights are a little bit of a mess. But there are a lot of commonalities outside of the United States, and thinking this from a global perspective, trying to think about how privacy rights are created in those spaces, whether it's in some kind of open data license or something like that, and doing it something similar for medical privacy might be an opportunity as well. But that's really the experiment, is how do we make a license around medical devices that's stronger than what you would see with something like the CERN hardware license.
I'm sure you're reading these off the channel here. Just recently, PP's asked about open monitoring software, how to get proprietary ventilator protocols.
Good question. You should probably send me email about this after that. So ventilator protocols, that can mean two different things. It can mean the internal data protocol used within the ventilator, or it could mean the medical protocol. The medical protocol is not closed in any way. It's all published in academic journals. I don't believe there's any value in cracking proprietary codes within a ventilator. Something like the VentMon gives you the ability to simply measure what it's doing. Ventilators are simple, which doesn't mean they're easy. It's not easy to build a ventilator that you would trust your mom to be on, but they are simple. So there's no particular reason to be concerned with that. I hope I haven't missed the point of that question. Back over to you, Bob.
So I'm going to ask the channel to come up with some more questions. We have one that it's sort of on the side here, because they're asking about GPUs, the graphic processors, and free drivers for graphic drivers. And I don't know what opinion you have in that, because it's all related to free hardware. But GPUs are a hot topic right now.
I have no comment on that. I don't know anything about that. But I see another question from PP, so let me try to answer that.
Excellent.
So I do believe it's going to be a long struggle to change the way hospital works, to make the medical information both secure and transparent. That is, if a particular instrument is instrumented in producing a data stream, we should insist that other firms be able to read that data stream. Now, of course, it's not transparent in the sense that it's medical information which is private to that person, and so it has to be protected in that sense. And this is going to take a long time to do. Right now, sophisticated intensive care units are plagued by the fact that none of those systems talk to each other very well, and so there's a strong incentive for them to purchase everything from one vendor, which is antithetical to what we're attempting to do here. That's why we created the Public Invention Restoration Data Standard as an example, but that's only a tiny, tiny start on probably what PPISA is asking about.
Very good. Are you seeing the commentary from GK Noth? Starts with, you spoke of duplication of effort. It's kind of interesting, and so I'm interested if you have any discussion related to that.
Oh, let me read it real fast.
Yeah, it's GK Noth. You spoke of duplication of effort. Because I'll just read it into the channel. Between well-meaning creators of FOSS ventilators in emergency management, he's a CAP volunteer, Civil Air Patrol, we have an incident command system to help disaster relief run more smoothly. I've also been a volunteer at the FEMA vaccination site in Philadelphia. I wonder if we need an equivalent to ICS, the incident command system. It's a standardized federal and just national command system. ICS to ramp up coordination of FOSS efforts if we ever have an emergency like this again.
I think it's an excellent question, and I think the answer is yes, within certain limits, right? Like for example, if someone like RMS had the stature when a emergency happened to have everybody follow them into a system where you could prioritize and manage efforts, that would be a tremendous boon. Okay, like most free software projects, someone could create an issue management system, a global issue management system, and try to distribute tickets out to free Libre open source software teams today. The question is, you know, who would follow that? I do think, however, the identification that there is a need for open source engineers, both software and hardware, to address acute emergencies is now something that the pandemic has made very clear. And if you think about what the Red Cross does, I know very little about the Civilian Air Patrol, but the Red Cross handles emergencies, and there are always emergencies. Therefore, the Red Cross smooths that out across time. They've handled floods and earthquakes and tsunamis before. They know how to deploy people in those situations. What I'm imagining, and it's a little bit science fiction-y, but I think we can accept it, is a system where, in addition to boots on the ground distributing bottles of water to people in an emergency, we have both software and hardware engineers standing ready to solve technical problems created by the next crisis. And the pandemic was a mother of crises, but it's not the last one. And so I do believe, I believe the last 30 years, we have been coming together, and the pandemic has made us come together even more. And I think we should just do what we've been doing and continue to build on that success. And I think the people at this conference have been pretty good at doing that in the past.
Rob, there's a follow-on question about earlier for getting the protocols for ventilators. It's like, if you wanted to get the protocols for ventilators, not for cracking purposes, but for getting the data for remote monitoring into a sister room. For example, remote check of the function of the device is an actual need of some hospitals.
Yeah, so I think I already answered that again. I mean, it's really a question of demanding open protocols. That's the main issue there. And most for-profit firms have a disincentive to participate in an open protocol. Therefore, I think some kind of legal action is necessary to spur that, until such time as the free software community builds an overwhelming presence, and then everyone will start participating in that system. And you know, we've seen that happen before with standards which sometimes become free. I don't know if do we have any more time?
We're in the last 2 minutes, so I think this would probably be time for taking one more question and then wrapping it up. And
okay,
so Mark wanted to say something.
Okay. So I was just the last question I'm seeing here is about how long is the FDA approval process. If the component is already approved, would it need to be checked again if that given component is connected to a component not yet approved? So the approval process, Rob, you might have a better idea of what the actual rough estimates are on it, but it's not a short period of time. It depends upon the complexity of the device, but the FDA does break up the approval process to kind of streamline it. So if you're making functionally equivalent devices, they have an expedited approval process around that, where they're just looking at the differences. And that would apply as well for components, depending upon how they're used, where they would try to reduce the double checking effort. But obviously, when you're creating a new system, the components might interact in a new way. So they want to make sure they don't miss that as well.
Very good. Well, with that, I think we'll have to leave it here. It's been an excellent discussion, and I know I've enjoyed it, and there's been a lot of discussion in the channel. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.